The firehouse was eerily quiet at 3 a.m., the kind of silence that crept into your bones. Firefighter Mark Lawson lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall. It had been years since he'd gotten a good night's sleep, not since the fire that took Danny Harper, his best friend and fellow firefighter. Mark's eyes had just begun to droop when the station phone rang, slicing through the stillness like a knife. He sat up with a jolt, heart racing. It was rare for the landline to ring. Most emergency calls came through dispatch radios. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and padded to the main office, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The phone kept ringing, an insistent shrill sound that made his skin crawl. Mark picked it up. "Firehouse 17, what's your emergency?" The voice on the other end was raw with fear. "Please, you have to help me," the caller choked out. "My house is on fire. I'm trapped inside." Mark's pulse quickened. "Stay calm. What's your address?" 172 Oakwood Drive, the man whispered. Mark froze. That address. It burned down years ago. He swallowed hard. "Are you sure that's the right address?" The voice on the line trembled. "Yes, please hurry. I'm in the upstairs bedroom. It's getting hotter." And then the line went dead. Mark's hands trembled as he hung up. He knew that address like the back of his hand. 5 years ago, 172 Oakwood Drive had been consumed by flames, claiming the lives of the entire Thompson family and Danny Harper. And yet, the voice, it sounded familiar, too familiar, like Danny. Mark rushed to the garage where Chris, his longtime partner, was still awake, sipping coffee and reviewing equipment. "Get the crew up," Mark said, his voice sharp. "We've got a fire." Chris frowned. "Where?" "Oakwood Drive." Chris froze, coffee spilling over the edge of his cup. "Mark, that place burned down, years ago." "I know," Mark said, already suiting up. "Just humor me." The fire truck roared to life, slicing through the dark streets toward the ruins of Oakwood Drive. Mark's grip on the wheel was tight, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Danny's face staring back at him. As they pulled up to the lot, the sight that met them made his heart pound harder. There was no fire, just the burned-out skeleton of the house, overgrown with weeds and debris, standing as a blackened reminder of tragedy. Mark stepped out cautiously, his breath visible in the cold air. The smell of burnt wood lingered, thick and stale, clinging to his senses. But then, deep in the wreckage, he heard it, a faint voice. "Help me!" Mark's blood turned to ice. "Did you hear that?" Chris looked pale, shaking his head. "No, man. I think you need to let this go." But Mark couldn't. He pressed forward into the ruins, his boots crunching over charred wood and broken glass. His flashlight flickered, struggling against the suffocating darkness. In the upstairs remains, where Danny had died, he found something that made his breath catch. A fireman's helmet, buried under a layer of soot, the number 17 still faintly visible. Danny's helmet. Mark staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He'd watched that helmet burn with his own eyes 5 years ago. It shouldn't be here. And then, from behind him, a whisper. "You left me." Mark spun around, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, empty space. Back at the station, Mark couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He reviewed the dispatch logs, scrolling through the night's calls. Nothing. There was no record of a call from Oakwood Drive. He picked up the phone, staring at it as if it held some dark secret. He pressed redial, heart pounding against his ribs. A robotic voice came through the line. "The number you have dialed is not in service." Chris sat down beside him, his eyes dark with concern. "Mark, you're chasing ghosts." Mark wasn't so sure anymore. Days passed, but the phone calls didn't stop. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., the phone rang, and every night, the same voice pleaded for help. It sounded more desperate each time. Mark started digging into old case files, poring over the fire report from Oakwood Drive. The details didn't add up. Arrival times were inconsistent. Witness statements contradicted each other, and the fire's origin never determined. He found an old article buried in the archives, mentioning a series of unexplained fires across town in the months leading up to Oakwood. Fires where residents reported hearing voices in the flames. Fires that Danny had investigated. One night, Mark couldn't take it anymore. He returned to Oakwood Drive alone, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a growing sense of dread. The night was silent, save for the whisper of the wind. But as he stepped into the ruins, the air grew thick, suffocating. The scent of smoke curled around him. And then he saw him. Standing in the ashes, just beyond the reach of his light, was Danny. His face was burned, his gear melted and twisted, but his eyes, those same haunted eyes, bored into Mark. "You left me," Danny's voice rasped, thick with pain. "Why didn't you come back?" Tears burned in Mark's eyes. "I tried. I thought you were gone." Danny's face contorted in anguish. "It's not over." Mark felt heat rising around him, flames licking at the edges of his vision. Shadows moved in the wreckage, twisting and curling like they were alive. "You have to stop it," Danny said, his voice growing distant, the fire consuming him once again. "Before it takes another one of us." Mark barely made it back to the station, shaken and breathless. When he burst through the door, Chris jumped up. "Mark, what the hell?" Mark could barely speak. "The fire, it's not finished." Chris's face paled. "You sound just like Danny did. Before he died." Mark stared at the station phone, waiting for the inevitable. At exactly 3 a.m., it rang again. This time, Mark didn't answer. Instead, he whispered, "I'm sorry, Danny," and unplugged it from the wall. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough, because some calls never really end, and some fires never die.